What is the number one move you should learn before doing a squat? I hope you didn't say burpees, because it's the hip hinge, which is the precursor to the deadlift. So we're going to teach you a few things. We're going to get down on the floor first. This move is called the hip rocker. We're trying to see if you can get your hips moving back and forward without affecting your back. So 4-point position, 2 hands, 2 knees, and we're going to firstly brace the core and then bark loudly like a dog. You don't bark like a dog. I just hope someone did that somewhere along the line on Instagram or YouTube, wherever. We're going to rock back and forward like this. So we're just seeing that we can move the hips. We're getting that hip flexion, hip extension. And that's the hip rocker. If you can do that effectively, you're on your way to deadlifting. All right, this one is a progression of the hip rock. It's called a bear rock. So we're just going to move forward and back on the hands, keeping those knees off the floor, bracing that core, and we're checking that we can get that hip hinge happening without affecting the back. We're not rounding out or overarching that lower back. So moving back and forward, and that's that next progression of the hip hinge to deadlift progression. Now that we've done the hip rock and the bear rock, we're going to move on to the back, making the hips the driver or the glutes the driver of that hip hinge movement. So heels on the floor, toes in the air like you just don't care, that joke. And then we're going to line our back and do a classic hip bridge. Squeezing the bum, driving the hips up, and you're going to repeat that process, making sure that we're training those glutes to extend those hips forward, and then as we drop back down, getting the hip flexors, the groins into play. Okay, now we've moved off the floor into a standing drill called the wall tap. So you need a wall behind you or a pole, standing about a foot away from the wall. We're teaching the hips to be the initiator of that hip hinge movement. So simply being soft at the knees, standing tall, we're going to push back and fall into the wall. It's as simple as that, but really teaching the hips to drive back into that movement, push back into that movement. You'll notice I'm not driving the knees forward, driving the hips back to start that hip hinge movement. Nice neutral spine. Simple as that. Here we have a drill called the kettlebell tap. A really good exercise to train that hip hinge movement and layer on top of that movement pattern. So I've used a couple of bumper plates to raise a kettlebell off the floor to give you that height, so I'm not affecting my hamstrings or my lower back too much with going too deep into a deadlift pattern. So standing about shoulder width apart, soft at the knees, we're going to push back with the bum, let the hands hang down from the shoulders. I'm pretending to look over a cliff without falling off the edge. I'm just going to tap the kettlebell, drive the hips forward to come back up into that hip extension, back into the flexions, the hip flexors, the groins all come into play, tap and up. So we're going to repeat that drill, keeping a neutral spine, looking over the edge of the cliff without falling off. So the weight's not on the heels, it's not exactly on the toes, it's about mid-foot, and tap the kettlebell. Really good exercise to understand that hip hinge movement so we're not driving down into a squat. This drill is an extension of what we just did. So we're going to be grabbing the kettlebell handle instead of tapping it. Same principles as before, feet about shoulder width apart. We're going to drive back with the hips soft at the knees, neutral spine, looking over the edge of the cliff without falling off. And we're going to squeeze that kettlebell handle and then drive back up, down again, squeeze that kettlebell handle. So we're starting to bring the lats and the arms and the shoulders into this move as well. Hips back and squeeze that kettlebell handle, maintaining that neutral spine and the core brace as well. So we do that about 10 times, and that's the kettlebell grip drill. So here we have the final drill that puts everything into place, from that hip rock to the bear rock to the wall taps to the hip hinge into an actual deadlift move where you're picking up the kettlebell. So shoulder width stance, facing forward, bracing that core. We're going to look over the edge of the cliff without falling off, and as we go down, hip hinge, we're going to grab that kettlebell. When you think about squeezing a golf ball in your armpit, and you're going to squeeze the armpits and drive up into that deadlift move, down and back up. We're keeping that neutral spine position, and we've really layered on top of that hip hinge into that deadlift pattern, which is a really good precursor before you learn the movement like the squat, where you're sitting down and back, into the squat, which is completely different to that hip hinge. But learning the hip hinge first is vital, and it helps avoid injury and gives you a clearer pathway to doing exercises like the lunge, single leg deadlifts. Beautiful thing to learn, the hip hinge. Please learn it.